All right, hello everybody. Now we have the panel titled The Death of the Architect. Made a lot of people concerned, especially people who have that title, I suppose. But you don't see any flowers, so don't worry, at least not for now. I'm just a moderator, and I'll get out of the way. I just want to quickly introduce here, we have Yogi Sri Krishnan. He's with HomeAway Expedia, and he wrote a post titled The Death of the Architect. This on, and he got a lot of attention, one of the most clicked and commented posts there, and he submitted a talk to SATURN, and we discussed during the evaluation process, the program committee, and we thought it would be a good idea to transform that into a panel, and here we are. We also have Tracy Bannon. She was with Deloitte, and she's passionate about software architecture, and she has the experience of building a sort of community of practice around architecture. She gave a testimony about that last year, which was fantastic. We have Jorge Fairbanks, author of Just Enough Software Architecture. Also important, he has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, works for Google, but above all, he can tell the difference between a West Coast IPA and a New England IPA very well, in details. Owen Woods, author of Software Systems Architecture, CTO of Endava, and Linda Northrop Award winner this year. So I'll ask each one of them to introduce themselves in a proper way and maybe give us a pitch about the topic, and then we will open up for a group discussion. So if you have questions, just keep your notes, and then you have a chance to ask them.
Thank you, Paulo, for the nice introduction. A privilege to share the dais with such esteemed thought leaders. So for a long time, our software engineering has been taking best practices out of real-life examples as well as other engineering disciplines, and we have been applying to software engineering. One such idea is the concept around architecture. We saw how traditional engineering was operating, how they produced a variety of artifacts and blueprints, and we realized that we need to structure our systems in a very similar fashion, especially when failure was very costly and risky, with waterfall being the prominent model. Soon we realized that it's best to serve somebody who has got a variety of experience to do this task, because the decisions, if made wrong, they were very costly mistakes and they can affect the delivery. And also, in order to increase the predictability of software delivery compared to other industries, we wanted to produce a variety of artifacts that could guide the development. We saw an era where a variety of the brick and mortar companies, they started embracing software. What happened as a result of this was these companies, they're used to working in a model where the decisions are top-driven. So you have a bunch of executors who go and execute. So that's when the idea of an architect making a variety of decisions with respect to software, it became prominent. They treated engineering as a low cost. That's why we saw so many people learning one or two programming languages, entering the IT industry, learning a database skill set, entering the IT industry. We saw proliferation of IT into other countries just based on the cost, not based on the talent. So that's the era we had earlier. So the role of the architect became very prominent because the architect was driving many of the decisions. The architect was literally drawing the blueprint. We had a variety of executors who would go and execute what was dictated to them. So more than engineers, we saw people getting reduced to programmers. So all of this has been happening for a while, but there are a few fundamental shifts that have happened in the industry. The first is the elimination of waterfall model. So we all now understand that we can't take decisions upright and follow it. We can only deliver software in an incremental fashion. The delivery of software is very different from a civil engineer project or other project. So we have chances to course correct. We don't have a very less knowledge workers here in this industry. So what we have is a bunch of talented engineers. Only by working collectively in a collaborative fashions, we get better decisions. So that's how we see now that best architectures, it emerge out of teams. It's not something that's top-driven, because we have people with variety of viewpoint. variety of ideas, it's by working collaboratively we could make better decisions. So the idea of making decision from a single person who has got more experience, I think that's being ripped out. The idea that the changes that are to be made are very expensive, I think that's also taken apart because waterfall is no more prominent. The companies, the way they operate is they're more open around embracing failure. They want to fail fast, learn from their mistake, apply their knowledge, and iteratively improve on it. So no more is the idea that certain decisions could be very costly, and we got to make a lot of these decisions way ahead of time. So similarly, there's another trend that's happening. So a lot of these traditional brick and mortar companies, they're now challenged by what is primarily a software company. You all would have heard this. Probably soon, the world's leading retail company is going to be a software company. World's leading lodging company is probably a software company. World's leading transport company is probably a software company. It's no coincidence that these companies, most of the places have eliminated the title architect. They give more importance to engineers. They set a very high hiring bar with respect to whom they hire as engineers. And these engineers can very easily perform the role of architect in a variety of companies. So with this, the role from being a programmer who merely executes, we see engineers who really understand variety of things about architecture. So we get architecture savvy engineers. That's how these companies, they have been successful. And we are seeing a trend where majority of these brick and mortar companies, they're going to get disturbed. Only companies which transform themselves into technology companies, they're going to survive. We're going to see a bloodbath in the industry where companies which don't really do the transformation or cost are not going to survive. And most of the companies which wish to do this transformation, they're going to mimic the structures that are put in place by the established software companies which are kind of operating without an architect. Also, we see the era of a modern developer. A modern developer today is cloud savvy. Probably he has done a certification on cloud. He knows to operate on cloud. He's security aware. He knows the vulnerabilities and risks associated with security. He is deploying the code. He's doing the QA. So we get full stack developers who operate the entire stack, not the era of somebody learning 1 or 2 programming languages and then making a career out of it for 10 or 15 years. That's going away. So when we get more and more engineers who are so tech savvy, automatically an architecture becomes a shared concern in the organization. So that's another big question mark around what the role of architect is going to be in the future. The second thing that's happening in the industry is... I'm done, 2 minutes. The second thing that's happening in the industry is the growth of tech-savvy product managers. People have realized that technical decisions are not something to be driven just by programmers. They have a business cost associated with it. So how do we make these important technical decisions? The product owners who earlier used to be business guys, now they're not just business guys anymore. They're tech-savvy product owners, and they are also involved in the decision-making process. So with all of these things, so far, architect has been a role which was bridging the gap between the technology and the business. With all of the new trends happening, what's the future of architect? There are either 2 options. We discover something new and go up in the value chain somehow. That's one option. Or the second option is elimination of this title architect. And that's what I mean by death of architect. So again, when I say death of architect, it shouldn't be seen as the death of architecture. The architecture would thrive. We'll have a rebirth of modern engineers who understand architecture and who'd help us take the architecture forward. But architects who are kind of bridging the gap between technology and business, those who are more technically aligned, getting back to programming, and those who are business aligned, getting back to product management, I think is the trend that's going to happen in the future. Thank you.
Is that working, guys? All right. Wow, that was a lot to consume. First thing, I'm going to start by saying that I hate the term full stack developer. I just want to get that out there. It just, but I got a lot of other stuff to say you might not clap at. So I do not believe that the architect is dead at all. I actually see everything that's going on right now as an absolute and complete liberation of the architect. So my point of view on this is that there's been so much responsibility bloat that's been tossed onto us. So I am a polymath. I need to learn as much as I can about the domains that I'm in, about all of the pieces and parts that I touch, about how I'm going to deliver. So I may get my Agile certification because it helps me to do what I need to do. And I may get my different cloud certifications because it helps me know what I need to do. But it doesn't mean that I should be the Scrum leader, which I see constantly happening. You're the architect, really, what do you do? Well, I lead the Scrums. Well, gosh, that's different. So the term itself, it's been bastardized, it's completely overloaded. Think about what TOGAF, love TOGAF, but think about what TOGAF has done. How many different types of architects are there? And in a waterfall organization, we have all of those silos that have happened as well. So as we are, instead of saying full stack developer, I will say that we need to have a full continuum architect. If you can understand what the big thoughts that you have to think at the enterprise level and be able to translate that across the continuum. I need to understand what happens with the business and the information flows. I need to understand the data impacts. I need to understand the impact on the engineering, on the app arc piece of this. I need to understand the technology underneath it. I should have always have understood that. I'm old enough to say that when I started my career, I had to know all that. And over the years, they've siloed me and siloed me and siloed me and siloed me until they say, well, you're this arc. This is your vertical. You're not in this horizontal. I think we're moving back to the horizontal. So I don't see death of the architect at all. I think there were some good points here. I see architects and engineers, two sides of the same coin. I don't believe that there's a magical demarcation between them. So yeah, the cloud is helping us reinvigorate, maybe you could say renovate what architects do. Think about the things that we've always had to do and won't change. Collaboration. I heard somebody say that architects make the decision. Hell no. My job has never been to make the decision in a silo on my own. My job has always been to drive my teams, who are intelligent humans that support me as their leader, to drive to a collaborative decision. Now, I may have to take ownership of a risk decision based on my experience, but part of that, right, is why we have developers who are coming in and learning the ropes. So I don't believe that people get reduced to programmers or relegated as developers. I believe that that's a stepping stone. And sometimes people like to stay there and want to remain there, and they're damn good at it, and that's okay too. There's not a pro or con for that one. So I've got to be a master communicator, master collaborator, master at mentoring, right? And again, back to being an experience-based leader. So yes, I have to be tech savvy and all of these things. I think we have to double down as polymaths, to your point. I know plenty of architects say I'm a Java architect. Really? Well, what else do you know? I'm a .NET architect. Really? What else do you know? Well, they actually know a whole lot more, but they've taken on that moniker. So if I were going to kind of summarize what I think we need to do, we need to continue to be polymaths, right? We need to continue to absorb as much as is relevant to where we are executing right now. If I'm working with governments, I might need to know some extra things that I don't have to know in a particular commercial instance. If I'm dealing with a lot of vendors, I may need to know a little bit more about how my organization is dealing with that. So tailor where you specialize a little bit, keep focusing on patterns. I really think everybody needs to embrace APIs and BFF, right? Your business-focused features, right? You need to embrace that, and everything is about integration. Everything is about integration. Human integration with our tools that we're using for our factory, for our pipeline, integration of components, integration of frameworks. So integration, integration, integration. I believe in just enough for everything that we're talking about. Just enough architecture, just enough testing, just enough collaboration, just enough documentation. So I'm big on just enough. Yeah. And I would say if you really want to ask any architect a question that lets you judge whether or not they're an architect, it follows on something that you said earlier. I will ask this during the interview process. I'll ask somebody and bring them onto my team. When was the last time that you delivered something to production? That's it. When was the last time you delivered something to production? If I have somebody that said, well, about 20 years ago, well, then we have to have a different conversation. So there you go, guys.
Let's try again. It's on. Yes. Okay. Great. Hey guys, I'm George. I didn't know there was going to be opening statements, so thank you for giving me a chance to prepare my thoughts. It's more fun in panels if somebody takes an exaggerated position, so let me try defending, or at least articulating, an exaggerated version of what I really feel. Okay, so don't come up to me later and like stick a knife in my back because I say something more strongly than so let's try something like, there are hardware stores. You know, you can go into the hardware store and you can buy parts, and there's an amazing characteristic that if you can buy a wrench and you can buy a nut that happen to go together really, really well. And it makes it really easy to put stuff together because your screwdriver and your screw just actually go together, right? This wasn't the case 100 years ago, right? Like a lot of stuff was custom tools that, you know, somebody was making, and in fact, at some point they were hand making nails and everything else, okay? If anyone here has tried to do some of the great things that we heard about this morning, architecture as code or continuous deployments or any of these things that we now can do, and there's open source projects we rely upon, if you tried to do that 10 years ago, boy, you had the scrapes all over your hands and you felt like you're making your own nails, and like maybe you decided it wasn't worth it. It was a good idea, but it wasn't worth it. Okay. So in some ways, we're way ahead. And we can just sort of say, go pick up that open source stuff. Go pick up that screwdriver and the nail, you know what I mean? And that's going to work out for you. Okay, so in some ways you could say, we've already killed off the architect, okay? Because we've empowered people to go to the hardware store, pick up some things, and it's probably going to work out, okay? And to some extent, you guys are probably already seeing that on your projects, right? Where in some ways, the people that are in charge on those projects do not have the background and education to try to get themselves trained up for that job, because guess what? It's probably going to work out, okay? So my question would be, have we killed off the architect too quickly, right? Are we really at the point where we can take someone off the project, the so-called architect from before, who thought that was their job, and they come to these conferences and try to get really good at that stuff, and they know what all the pattern names are, and they know what the technologies are good for, and they know how to evaluate risks across a lot of different dimensions? Did we take those people off the projects before stuff is really plug and play? And I'm thinking, I think in a lot of places we probably have. Again, that's the exaggerated version that I will try to defend here on the panel today. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Owen Woods. So when I started thinking about this, being me, I dived into the middle of the problem and made lots and lots of notes. And then I thought, what problem was I trying to solve when I started thinking? So I tried to step back and think, if you wanted an architect, what problem would you be trying to solve? And there's a couple of things that need to be solved on projects, which might or might not lead you to having an architect. And one of them is someone or a group of people need to have a holistic view of the system. Now, a lot of this is context specific, and at small scale, these are trivial problems. But a lot of the systems that I've worked on over the years, they're sort of 500,000 lines of code is quite small, 2-3 million lines of code is quite big. So there's a lot of it. I've worked on, for example, clearing and settlement platforms where there were relatively few people who knew how all the bits fitted together. And they were a small number, and they might have been called architect or not, but they were the only people who had that view. You've also got people who have an external focus. Some developers are really good at this, about contextualizing their work and thinking about how it fits into a much larger landscape. And I've met many, many who aren't very comfortable doing that. They either don't have the knowledge or experience, or it's not they don't care, they just want to focus on other stuff. So someone's got to be able to do that. And then you've got the thing that everybody who calls themselves an architect obsesses about, which is system qualities, cross-cutting concerns. You are going to have some qualities of a system, like security and scalability and performance and all those that we're all so familiar with, where they cannot be solved by one team working by themselves. They have to be solved across the teams. And in fact, in some projects at Endava, we don't have an explicit architect, so we have organizational constructs like technical leadership scrums. but actually they're doing architecture work, whether or not they're explicitly labeling themselves as architects. And the last reason I think a lot of organizations have them is because it gives people career paths and it massages egos. And that's not a good reason to have them, but if you're actually looking for why people have architects, that's definitely one of the reasons I've come across. And whether you have a responsibility to do architecture work, or you have one or more people labeled as architects, I think that's highly contextual. It's about culture, it's about scale, it's about the kind of work you're working on. When I worked in product engineering, there were no architects. There were staff and senior staff engineers. And I had the privilege of being a staff engineer at Sybase. And I was expected to make architectural decisions every day. And I was expected, we were quite document-centric, I was expected to produce deliverables with architecture in the title. So, I was doing architecture work. The key thing is the work needs to be done. It's all very well saying, we haven't got any architects, as long as the work gets done. And that's the anti-pattern I've seen a few times, which is, we are far too smart to need architects. That's very reassuring to hear, I would answer. How do you distribute security policy across the system? Oh yeah, security. Yeah, security is not really a big thing for us. Right, well, maybe it should be. And in fact, when I was in investment banking, it's one of the reasons I tended to find it relatively easy to deal with development teams who were very agile, because I was prepared to take on quality properties, like compliance, disaster recovery, security, that individual teams really, really struggled to solve because you needed a very broad view to solve them. So the key principles that I've always had with architecture is whoever does it, you've got to integrate it into the whole development organization. If you've got an architecture team and delivery team, you've got a disaster. Or you've got some irrelevant architects and you should get rid of them, one or the other. Architects must have, I love this thing, when did you deliver to production? That was the thing. I used to say not when you deliver to exactly, but when did your work have an effect directly on production? And that's always the question to keep asking. So if you're not affecting production, you're probably not having a huge impact. And I see this recent thing about PaaSes, and we've gone microservices, and now microservices are a bit boring, so we're all going to go serverless, because it worked very well in the mainframe era, so we're going to try it again. That means we won't need any architects. And I do kind of look at that and kind of wonder what the reasoning is. Just because you've got a very, very powerful, complex tool set doesn't mean that you're not going to have to work out how to use it in a consistent way across quite a large organization. So again, I'm not suggesting you need a person, but I think some people are going to have to figure out how to use these tremendously impressive, powerful platforms. Otherwise, they are going to end up with a bit of a mess. So it led me to go on my final question is, whether or not you need an architect probably depends on what you mean by what is a developer. As long as a developer includes all of the work from concept, ideation, right through to production, across all the dimensions of a system, you clearly don't need a job title called architect.
Okay, we now open for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and make the question to one of the panel members or to the panel.
So the panel, so you think that the discipline of software architecture over the past 20 to 30 years has delivered on the value proposition to the business that it is made or environment that it is made? And how do you think that, whether it's yes or no, or to whatever extent you think it's yes or no, how does that fit into the answer about the death of the architect or not death of the architect?
I was a kid 20, 30 years ago.
So was I, but I'll answer it. I hate to say it depends, because that's like the theme this week. We're saying that all the time. But it depends. The size of the organization and how, so the smaller the organization and the more collaborative that the organization has been, I think the more that they gained value from that as the organization. I'm working with a number of federal agencies right now, and I'm actually helping the IRS as well. Huge, right? Just freaking huge. And following all of those waterfall organizational constructs, and I can ask that question, when was the last time you impacted production? And I hear some good answers, and I hear some not so good answers. So the answer is, it depends on the organization itself and the culture of that organization. What we are seeing, though, is that these mega organizations that have very boxes that they're putting people into didn't get the value that they needed. So if you regimented, checklisted, these are your roles and responsibilities, thou shalt not cross outside your lane, then I think that's where you did have failures.
Speak up, please. My question is for the, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but the first, yeah. So if you push the responsibility of the architect all the way down to the team and let them focus on what's best for them, what I struggle to understand is when you're dealing with systems that are systems of systems and ecosystems, and if you read anything about theory of constraints, you cannot optimize the whole by optimizing the local. You have to look at the whole and say, how do we optimize across the system of systems to know where we're going to get most of our throughput? So if every team has this responsibility of architect on the team, who is responsible for architecting the whole that is the ensemble of those teams?
So the way I see this is, it's not the architecture that's going away. You still carry your engineer title. A group of senior engineers who still go and work for different teams, they would still drive decisions. By carrying the title engineering, it allows the it allows us to do more engineering work. But the title architect, as she said, has become so diluted. It has become pretty much a dumping ground for any work. And for most of us whose appetite is to do technically challenging work, the title architect has kind of become a challenge in many places. I mean, I'm not again saying all the places, but it's still, there are going to be groups which are going to decide how all of these systems are going to work together. That's not going to go away.
But if we're going to talk about titles, the title engineer has become amazingly diluted by the software industry recently. I mean, considering where the bar is meant to be for professional engineer, 9 weeks at a Node.js school does not mean engineer. And a lot of people are calling themselves that. So
That's a good thing.
Something to throw out there for folks to consider is the impact that the cloud will have in a negative way on folks. So I will often get parachuted into situations where we might not be succeeding. And that happened twice recently. And in both cases, we had fantastic young bucks, knew their stuff, had their certifications. They could dance circles around me when it came to telling me exactly what services that they were going to use. However, they went out, they used the WYSIWYG, they got the reference architectures that they pulled down off the internet. They didn't understand to think through the architectural trade-offs, and Shazam, they had problems. So experience matters. For even the folks that are just coming out of school, the first thing that I talk to them about on any of my teams is that they better go out and understand architectural trade-off. So I send them out to look at the ATM, and we talk about software quality attributes, and we start driving that home, because that's the core essence of what we have to do is evaluation and trade-off, right? And you've talked about big picture, the granular picture, all of the different levels of vision matter, and you're going to have different people doing it. So it's unfortunate that we're in this label discussion right now, because I think we've all said that architecture as an activity ain't going nowhere. The term architect and engineer, it's highly diluted. Maybe we just all band together and rebrand it as something else, who knows. But just want you guys to think about how we are potentially hurting ourselves by making things oversimplified at times, because it does introduce a danger.
So if I could try to summarize the question, it was something along the lines of, if we push responsibilities down to local stuff, who's going to take care of the global stuff? Like, you may not have the visibility into the global stuff in order to be able to solve it. I have to admit, I have been surprised at companies. I've seen companies that work that way, and you may watch them fail on a couple cycles of they missed the big picture. But after a little bit, they chat with each other, or they recognize the failure, and they actually make a team that handles that in particular. I want to double down on Owen's point from his opening, which is the bigger danger is nobody realizes they need to be worrying about some particular thing. And it could be a really bad outcome if nobody thinks they should be doing it. So it goes to the point of, if you download the reference model, that might get you 80% of the way there, but you didn't understand how you needed to customize it.
So I have a quick question. Last year at SATURN, I actually had a few slides up front and welcome remarks on the first day that talked about the theme of this panel, and there was a slide about architecture without architects, and I was concluding saying we are all architects now and sort of thing. Well, I work in IT. It's a mid-sized organization. I don't work for a software company. It's typical IT, and that was May 2017. I went back home. September, my group in that IT department, which was the software architecture group, was disbanded. And we actually saw that coming, and now there's no central software architecture group. I joined one of the dev teams, and picking up a term that I heard last year, I think it was Michael Keeling, democratization of architecture. The teams got absolute autonomy to choose technology, to choose the way they design and implement, and that group has used Java-based, the Java language, Java platform for 15 years, and in 1.5 years now we have Python, Java, Kotlin, and Groovy, and that's one side. And the architecture group had decided, okay, let's go with Angular. At some point it was Angular 4. Now we have Angular, Node.js, we have Vue, and we have Ember. Oh, no, not Ember, React. And recently, just a couple weeks ago, we had a meeting with the head of IT, and they sensed what was going on, and we got together, and we went to the whiteboard, and we tried to list all the different technologies and things we were using, and they really got concerned, and we formed this kind of architecture guild inspired by Spotify, and we try to pull key people from different teams as a way to bring some sort of standardization in terms of technology choices. So no central governance on architecture, but some cohesion among the teams. So in Spotify, they call that an architecture guild. So would that be a good idea, you think, if in an IT department where that kind of democratization is happening?
Well, it certainly solves the problem of having this sort of ivory tower separate group. So I think there's lots of ways to do it. When I was with BGI, what we did was we had an application architecture group, actually, and people did report to me, but they sat with the teams in the solution areas that they served. So they were, day to day, they were part of their organization. The only reason they reported in Century was for career path reasons, because nobody ever knew what to do with an architect at salary review time or at, evaluation time. So we gave them a career path, but day to day, yeah, they absolutely worked in a distributed way with their own teams. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it works well.
Internally in our firm, we actually follow the same thing in terms of having we have guilds, and we have a guild around machine learning and what, having certain bar that people have to be able to demonstrate or cross to get there. But the same thing from an architecture perspective. It's harder going into, because I'm as a consultant going into different organizations, it is interesting to see how dependent they become on whoever's doing those architectural things. So whether they've been decentralized or whether they're centralized, just going back to somebody's got to make the decision. George, you said earlier, somebody's got to be watching the back door to make sure things are going okay.
All right, so thinking about this, reflecting on it now, I don't think I understand the premise of the topic, right, of the panel. So, if you look at some of the evidence around, there's more software architecture conferences than there have ever been before, right? There's at least 4 or 5 in Europe, where there might have only been one even 3 years ago. I wonder if we're not maybe discussing the depth of the architect, but perhaps the depth of a vision for what an architect used to be, or something like that. And I don't know, I can't help but be reminded of that Kylo Ren quote from the Last Jedi, right? Past die, kill it if you must. Is that or is there something else that maybe I'm missing?
I think practice has moved on, at least in the self-selecting kind of group that comes to things like SATURN. Certainly, I've had quite a journey since I became an architect, and if you'd asked me in my first couple of years, I'd have said my job is to define the key structures and then make sure they're fit for purpose and then help everyone implement them. And greatly influenced by Elcho, actually. I've been on quite a journey since then to actually my job is to make the decisions just in time that guide the project to a good place technically. And I mean, I think it's not like it's just me. It's thousands of architects have come to the same conclusion. And so therefore, yeah, maybe the vision's changed, or, just what the expectations have changed.
I would agree. And when they first sent the title of the panel over, I was a little aghast, because I don't subscribe to death of anything. It's, again, a liberation. I think it's a re-envisioning. Maybe we're just centering back up because there's been so much extra thrown about on it, and we've put too many artificial lines in place. I think that hopefully this will help to free that up, actually. Now, I believe that's why you're seeing more conferences about it, because there have been more and more failures as people have tried to do different types of things. I'm hoping that in some of those other conferences, they're also having a similar discussion, that architecture and engineering is cornerstone, and you have to have vision at different levels. I love your description, by the way, how you just described. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so I think if the architect is dead, then the world is doomed. Because I think what I'm seeing all around me is the result of it's a pendulum, the central coordination, decentral coordination, it goes back and forth. Architecture teams get disbanded and then they get put back in the central position again. It's just a pendulum, and to the architect it doesn't really matter, because they are the connection between central and decentral anyway, so it doesn't matter where they are exactly. However, the pendulum has recently swung so far towards decentral decision making that I think the world is starting to drown in a pool of technical debt. And I think the architect's function is the only function that can actually even have a small chance of getting us out of that pool of technical debt.
Yeah, I agree. So taking my extreme position, I would say that yes, the architect was killed off in many places before the replacement was available, and the replacement could be, as people have talked about, the rising up of skills on the decentralized teams so that they're ready to do the evaluation and think through the problems in the way the architect did before, but the technical debt has happened as a result of those teams not having been trained up. I will point out that there's a dangerous idea in the water that says that these skills are actually not important or counterproductive, right? So I think it might be the exaggerated view of you ain't gonna need it and last responsible moment. If you take those two things together, from my perspective, I think you can end up in a bad place where you actually think that evaluating a design from multiple perspectives is a bad idea, right? It's a waste of time, right? Like there's no user story on the backlog that says, make sure that we're not painting ourselves into a corner for quality attribute X, because no one's asked for it yet, because it's the first week, okay? That's what I worry about. But I do think also that there's lots of signs of hope that the decentralized teams, as Michael pointed out, are opting into design conferences so that they can chat about these topics.
There are some empirical studies that actually confirm that in many open source software, developers are not aware of architecture at all. And somehow, although we've seen the growth of conferences, software architecture conferences, but I personally observed that the number of submissions of the paper have been increasing a lot. So, somehow both the scientific community of software architecture. So somehow I see this trend. Let's say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the architecture topic was hot, but today is not at all.
That's certainly the case in Europe, but I can tell you exactly why, because I also have a university affiliation. It's simply because there's no funding. It's got nothing to do with industrial demand, because industrial demand doesn't drive research funding. And it doesn't really have anything to do with academics' interests, because they're interested in where the research funding comes from. I know it's a slightly cynical view, but actually, I think it's reasonably accurate. So I think that's why conferences like EXA are finding it hard to get as many submissions as they used to.
Actually, I'm wondering if it's just because we're all busy putting out all the fires from all the teams that don't have architects, so we don't have time to do the writing.
Specifically about research, I guess. So researchers tend not to put out fires.
I'm just joking.
Yeah, so the way I see this is there are new concepts like lean startup getting popular. This is an era where big enterprises are trying to behave like a startup. Startups mostly did not have architects. They're more into the execution mode. They want to build a proof of concept, verify, and then invest more.
Well, if we're going to bring a bit of contentious to it, I completely disagree, having worked in startups. They normally have a single, totally dominant engineer making every single architectural decision, understanding every line of code in the product. They have the, like, is it the red pill or the blue pill? Can't remember. They have the totally dominant engineer. That's my experience of startups.
No, I'm just saying, like, the reason why there is a push towards delivery, because people take things as hypothesis and want to prove it first before investing more. That's the reason why the companies are more pushed to even build things which
absolutely.
take some
But
technical.
I don't necessarily think that that means that a large organization wants to behave like they don't want to become a startup, because they have too many other accoutrements that the startup is trying to get there, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to look at that and they're saying, well, there's some really excellent principles there that we should apply. All right, so innovation, fail fast, being able to, how can I say this? Allow people to fail, because there's a lot of risk in large organizations. There can be a lot of, you don't want to fail, so the visibility of those things. There's a mindset shift that has to happen, but it doesn't, I would definitely not say that large organizations are really trying to become like startups. I think they're, to your point, there is that one engineer, there is that group of engineers that still understands a lot and has to understand a lot.
All right, another thought. So, interested in your comments on this one. So, I wonder if architects aren't necessarily dead or dying. We just can't hear them anymore because we have so many developers these days. I'm thinking specifically, there's some statistic I heard yesterday or the day before that, forgetting about the number of hundreds of thousands of new developers, year over year, extreme growth, right? Way more growth than what we probably have for our architects or architectural thinkers. I don't know, what might be your thoughts or your experiences on that as a possible explanation for this feeling that has brought us all together, even if it might not be a literal thing?
Well, one data point would just be my own company. I'd say the architects, we never have enough of them. We have quite a high hiring bar, and when we need another one, they're quite hard to hire from outside. We try and grow them internally, but slow process. They do tend to be spread pretty thinly. Yes, I mean they're either embedded in one project a long time because there's a huge amount to do, or they spend short periods on a number of projects. So, yeah, maybe they just spread a bit thin. Yeah, one of the guys who works for me jokes, yeah, we apply homeopathic doses of architecture and hope that it has an impact.
That might have been a better panel title.
Yeah, so we had this, we'll do a report on the workshop we had yesterday, which was about growing great software designers. And two things that came out, 2 data points people pointed out. One was about what Michael just talked about the, who was it that mentioned that one? But they said basically the rate of increase of number of software engineers in the world is just at this crazy rate. And so you end up with an enormous number of people with very small amounts of experience. Okay, that's just like the nature of the beast while you're growing very fast. And the second thing that was mentioned, and I think it resonated with a lot of people, was if you are not rewarded in your company for preventing the fire, then like if you put out the fire that you caused and you're like, woo, Owen did this great thing, well, then that also spells the death of the architect, right? Because like at some point you figure out that like, oh, I just need to code twice as fast and make more mistakes and then fix the problems and because I'm not getting valued for...
Setting your own fire, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, if you make sure our company never gets into compliance troubles and you're the one that gets us out of compliance troubles that invariably happen, and Owen doesn't get promoted and you do get promoted, well, guess what Owen's going to start doing? He's going to The death of the architect can come in different forms, right?
You go from being architect to being firefighters. Right?
Look, the discussion can go on during the breaks, and these guys are available through the end of the conference. And there's also the Death of the Architect article that Yogi wrote to DZone. You can always go there and take a look and comment, because there's a thread of comments there, very rich. But for now, we are out of time, so let's just thank Owen, George, Trace, and Yogi.